In the small town of Oak Creek, respect is earned through sweat and soil. But for two wealthy city boys, an old farmer in a tattered denim jacket was nothing more than a punchline. They saw a man out of time, clutching a rusted iron box like it was made of gold. They laughed at his clothes, his truck, and his garbage box. But as the lid creaked open, the air in the room went cold. When the shop owner, a battle-hardened veteran, stepped through the door, he didn't see a farmer. He saw a ghost from a war that officially never happened. This is the story of the day the world finally learned who Silas Thorne really was. The morning sun over Oak Creek didn't just shine, it glared. It was the kind of heavy, relentless heat that turned the horizon into a shimmering mirage and made the very air feel like a thick, invisible soup. In this forgotten corner of the American heartland, time didn't move in seconds or minutes, it moved in seasons. People here measured their lives by the height of the corn, the depth of the winter snow, and the calluses on their palms. At the edge of the town square, tucked between a faded post office and a closed-down diner, sat Miller's Tactical and Arms. It was a building made of heavy timber and local stone, a structure that looked as though it had grown out of the earth itself. The sign hanging above the entrance was weathered, its gold leaf lettering peeling away to reveal gray, sun-bleached wood underneath. To a stranger, it looked like a relic of a bygone era. To the locals, it was a sanctuary, a place where the weight of a weapon was matched only by the responsibility of the man carrying it. Inside, the atmosphere changed instantly. The air was cooler here, thick with the sharp metallic tang of gun oil, the dry aroma of aged cedar, and the faint lingering scent of gunpowder. The shop was a labyrinth of history. High-tech modern rifles sat side by side with antique bolt-action hunters, their polished barrels reflecting the low hum of the overhead ceiling fans. Elias, a young man in his early 20s with a military-style buzz cut and eyes that missed nothing, was meticulously wiping down the glass display cases. He took immense pride in his work. He knew every scratch on the floorboards and every serial number on the wall. For Elias, this wasn't just a job, it was an apprenticeship under the legendary Marcus Miller. The sharp, clear chime of the door above the silence cut through the silence. In walked two young men who looked like they had been airlifted straight from a luxury high-rise in the city. They were draped in tactical fashion, expensive cargo pants that had never touched a speck of mud, and moisture-wicking shirts that cost more than most people in Oak Creek made in a month. They moved with a swagger that was born of unearned confidence and a complete lack of situational awareness. "Check this place out, Tyler," the shorter one said, his voice loud and grating in the quiet shop. "It's like a time capsule from the 50s. Do they even have Wi-Fi in this hole?" Tyler, a tall man with perfectly styled hair and a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face, let out a dry laugh. "I doubt they even have electricity, Jake. Look at these displays. It's a museum for dinosaurs. I don't even know why we stopped here." Elias tightened his grip on his cleaning cloth but kept his head down. He had dealt with tourists before, but these two felt different. They weren't just visiting, they were colonizing the quiet with their arrogance. They began to wander around the shop, touching the displays with greasy fingers and making loud, mocking comments about the old-fashioned gear. 10 minutes later, the door opened again, but this time there was no sharp chime. The door moved slowly, heavily, as if the very air was resisting its entry. Silas Thorne stepped into the shop. He was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the very oak trees he spent his life tending. His face was a complex map of deep lines and sun-darkened skin, a testament to 70 years of fighting the elements. He wore a faded blue denim jacket, patched at the elbows with mismatched fabric, and work boots that were more dried mud than leather. His hands, gnarled and scarred like ancient tree roots, clutched something wrapped in an old, oil-stained burlap sack. He moved with a slight, rhythmic limp, a slow but deliberate gait that suggested he wasn't in a hurry because he had already seen everything the world had to offer. He walked straight toward the counter, ignoring the two city boys who had stopped to stare at him. With a heavy, metallic thud that made the glass display case vibrate, he placed the burlap-wrapped object on the counter. Tyler and Jake exchanged a delighted look. To them, Silas was a gift, a visual punchline for their social media followers. "Whoa, watch the glass there, Grandpa," Tyler said, stepping closer with a predatory grin. "That counter probably costs more than your entire farm. What do you have in the sack? Your lunch? Or did you find some scrap metal in the woods?" Jake chuckled, already pulling out his latest model smartphone. "Check it out, guys," he whispered into the microphone, his camera lens focused on Silas's weathered face. "Local flavor at its finest. This guy looks like he just stepped out of a storm cellar from the Great Depression." Silas didn't look at them. He didn't even acknowledge that they were in the room. His eyes, a piercing, faded blue that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 storms, were fixed on the back door of the shop, the one that led to Marcus Miller's private office. "I'm here from Marcus," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange resonant power, a low rumble like distant thunder rolling over the plains before a massive storm. Elias cleared his throat, feeling the tension in the room thickening. "Mr. Miller is in the back, Mr. Thorne. He's finishing up some inventory paperwork. Can I help you with anything in the meantime?" Silas shook his head slowly. "No. This needs his eyes and his hands." Tyler leaned over the counter, invading Silas's personal space. He sniffed the air ostentatiously. "Is that the smell of manure or just general failure? Come on, old-timer, show us what's in the bag. We're experts. We've seen the best tactical gear money can buy. Maybe we can tell you if your treasure is worth enough for a hot meal at the diner." Silas finally turned his head. He looked at Tyler, not with anger, but with a strange, quiet kind of pity. It was the look a lion might give a yapping toy dog before deciding it wasn't worth the energy to growl. "The things in this world that have real value," Silas said softly, "don't usually come with a price tag, and they certainly don't fit in your phone's camera lens." Jake scoffed, still filming. Deep thoughts from the dirt farmer. "Seriously, open it up. Let's see the junk. I bet it's a rusted-out revolver that'll blow your hand off if you try to fire it. This is a place for professionals, not for people bringing in garbage." Silas's hands tightened around the burlap. Underneath the fabric, the sharp, rectangular outline of a metal box was clear. It was heavy. It was ancient. And as the shop's fluorescent lights caught a tear in the burlap, a faint, almost imperceptible metallic glint peeked through. "It's a dying wish," Silas whispered, more to himself than to the boys. "A legacy that's been buried too long. My grandson needs to know where he comes from." The two young men erupted into fresh waves of laughter. "A dying wish! Did you hear that, Jake? He's a character from a bad movie. What is it, Grandpa? A map to a buried treasure under the pig pen? Or maybe your secret recipe for moonshine?" They didn't see the shadow that appeared in the doorway of the back office. They didn't see the man who stood there frozen, his eyes widening as he stared at the burlap sack on the counter. Marcus Miller, a veteran who had served in 3 different conflicts and carried the scars of a dozen Black Ops missions on his soul, didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched the old man and the arrogant boys, his breath hitching in his chest. Because Marcus knew that specific type of burlap, he knew that weight. And most importantly, he knew that the man standing in front of his counter was the one person in the world he never expected to see alive again. The mockery continued, Tyler reaching out a hand to poke at the bag. "Come on, just a peek." But Silas's hand shot out with a speed that defied his 70 years. He caught Tyler's wrist in a grip of iron. The laughter stopped instantly. Tyler's face went from smug to pure shock as he realized he couldn't move his arm. It felt like his wrist was caught in a hydraulic vice. "Don't," Silas said. The word wasn't a request, it was a command, cold and sharp as a bayonet in the moonlight. At that moment, Marcus finally stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the shop. "Let him go, Silas," Marcus said, his voice strangely thin and trembling, a sound Elias had never heard from his boss. "He doesn't know. He couldn't possibly know who you are." The air in Miller's tactical and arms suddenly felt like it had been sucked out of the room. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was heavy, vibrating with a tension that Elias could feel in his teeth. Tyler, whose wrist was still locked in Silas's iron grip, was no longer smirking. His face had turned a pale, sickly shade of white, and his eyes were darting toward Marcus Miller, hoping for some kind of intervention. Marcus walked around the counter, his boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Each step felt like a drum beat in a funeral march. He didn't look at Tyler. He didn't look at Jake, who had finally lowered his phone, his thumb hovering nervously over the stop record button. Marcus's eyes were fixed solely on Silas Thorne, or more accurately, on the man Silas used to be. "Let him go, Silas," Marcus repeated, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "He's just a boy who's never had to bleed for anything. He's not worth the effort." Silas slowly opened his fingers. Tyler yanked his arm back as if he had been touched by a hot stove, rubbing his wrist where the red marks of Silas's fingers were already starting to darken. He tried to say something, some clever retort to regain his dignity, but the words died in his throat when he saw the look in Marcus's eyes. It wasn't the look of a shopkeeper. It was the look of a predator watching two scavengers. "Marcus," Silas said, his voice gravelly and weary, "I didn't come here for trouble. I came because the time is short. The box, it started to change. The seal is breaking." Marcus reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the oil-stained burlap. He didn't pull it away. Instead, he stroked the fabric with a reverence that made Elias's heart race. "I haven't seen this marking since the Highlands in '74, Silas. We were told everything was destroyed. We were told the unit was burned to the ground, records, men, and gear alike." "The fire didn't catch everything," Silas replied, his faded blue eyes tracking Marcus's movements. "Some things are too cold to burn, Marcus. Some memories stay frozen until they are forced into the light." Jake, unable to handle being ignored any longer, tried to push his way back into the conversation. "Wait, what unit? What are you guys talking about? Is this some kind of ARPing thing? Marcus, tell this old guy to move his junk so we can look at that customized AR-15 we saw on your website." Marcus turned his head slowly. The intensity in his gaze was so sharp that Jake actually took a step back, hitting a display rack of hunting vests. "Jake," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low, "if you or your friend say one more word, one more syllable, I will bar you from this shop for life. And in a town like Oak Creek, you'll find that life gets very difficult when I decide someone isn't welcome. Do you understand me?" The two city boys nodded vigorously, their bravado completely evaporated. They retreated to a corner of the shop, standing near the door like chastised schoolchildren, but they didn't leave. Curiosity had replaced their arrogance. They wanted to see what was in that box. Marcus turned back to Silas. "Come into the back office. We can't do this out here." "No," Silas said firmly. "It happens here, in the light. My grandson will be here in an hour. He needs to see it. He needs to know that his grandfather wasn't just a man who pulled weeds and fixed fences. He needs to know the price of the peace he's grown up in." Elias watched as Marcus nodded slowly. Marcus walked to the front door, flipped the sign to closed, and locked the deadbolt. The click of the lock echoed through the store like a gunshot. "Elias," Marcus commanded, "get the specialized cleaning kit, the one in the velvet case under my desk, and bring the industrial-grade solvent. We're going to need more than just oil for this." Elias scrambled to obey. He ran to the back, his mind racing. Who was Silas Thorne? He had lived in Oak Creek his whole life, known as the quiet farmer who kept to himself, the man who lived in the cabin on the ridge that no one ever visited. Now, the toughest man Elias knew, Marcus Miller, was treating him like royalty. When Elias returned with the kit, Silas had finally begun to wrapping the burlap. He did it slowly, as if he were peeling back layers of his own skin. As the fabric fell away, the box was finally revealed in its entirety. It was a heavy iron chest, about the size of a large toolbox. It was covered in a thick layer of rust that looked like dried blood. There were no brand names on it, no serial numbers, just a single embossed symbol on the top, a skeletal hand clutching a compass rose. As Silas touched the latch, a strange sound filled the shop, a faint, high-pitched hum like the vibration of a tuning fork. The two boys in the corner whispered to each other, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. "The seal," Marcus whispered, leaning in closer. "You kept it active all this time?"
"I had to," Silas said. "If I hadn't, they would have found it. The trackers don't stop looking for something this keemped. They thought it went down with the chopper in the jungle. They never suspected a farmer in the Midwest would have the strength to keep the dampening field alive." With a final, decisive movement, Silas clicked the latch. The metal groaned, a sound of agony that seemed to resonate in the very floorboards of the shop. A thin sliver of golden light began to leak from the seam of the lid, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of rifles on the walls. "Inside this box," Silas said, his voice rising in strength, "is the reason I never stayed for dinner, the reason I never told my son about his mother, and the reason I've spent 40 years looking over my shoulder at every black SUV that passed my gate." He threw the lid back. The light was blinding for a split second, and then it settled into a soft, pulsating glow. Inside the box, nestled in deep red velvet that looked as fresh as the day it was made, sat a series of objects that defied explanation. There was a silver-plated Colt 1911, its grip made of ivory with the same skeletal hand insignia carved into it. Beside it lay a heavy, jagged piece of dark metal, a fragment of something that didn't look like it belonged on Earth. And in the center, pinned to a piece of weathered olive-drab fabric, was a medal. It wasn't a purple heart, it wasn't a silver star. It was a medal Elias had never seen in any history book, a dark obsidian disc with a single glowing red stone in the center. "The obsidian star," Marcus breathed, his eyes watering. "The medal of the invisible 50. Silas, you're the last one. You're the last man standing from the ghost unit." At that moment, a loud engine roared outside. A sleek, modern military vehicle pulled up to the curb, its blacked-out windows reflecting the harsh Oak Creek sun. Silas looked at the door, his jaw tightening. "He's here. My grandson, and it looks like he brought company he wasn't supposed to." The door shook under a heavy blow. The silence of the shop was shattered. The past hadn't just been revealed, it had arrived to collect its debt. The thunderous pounding on the heavy timber door of Miller's Tactical and Arms sent a jolt through everyone in the room. The glass cases rattled and the dust of decades seemed to dance in the air, shaken loose by the sheer force of the blow. The two city boys, Tyler and Jake, scrambled further into the corner, their faces pale and their bravado completely replaced by genuine terror. They had come looking for a laugh, but they had walked into a war zone. Marcus Miller didn't hesitate. He reached under the counter, his hand emerging with a heavy tactical shotgun, the slide racking with a crisp, authoritative clack-clack. "Elias, get behind the ballistic shield at the back counter, now," Marcus commanded, his voice no longer that of a shopkeeper, but of a sergeant major in the heat of combat. Silas Thorne, however, remained unnervingly still. He stood by the open, rusty box, the golden glow reflecting in his weathered eyes. He didn't reach for a weapon, he didn't duck for cover, he stood like a monument of old stone, weathered but unbreakable. "It's not them, Marcus," Silas said quietly, his voice cutting through the tension. "At least, not yet. That's my grandson's knock, but he's not alone. I can hear the cadence of boots behind him, government-issue soles, thick, heavy, and synchronized." The door shook once more, and a muffled voice drifted through the thick wood. "Grandpa, it's Leo! Open the door! There are men here. They say they're with the Department of Defense. They say you have something that belongs to the state." Marcus looked at Silas, a silent question in his eyes. Silas nodded slowly. "Let them in, Marcus. The secret has a shelf life, and ours just expired." Marcus moved to the door, his movements fluid and cautious. He unlocked the deadbolt and stepped back, keeping the shotgun at a low, ready position. The door swung open, and the harsh Oak Creek sunlight flooded the shop, silhouetting the figure standing on the sidewalk. In stepped Leo Thorne, a young man in his early 20s, dressed in a crisp military cadet uniform. He looked exactly like a younger version of Silas. Same broad shoulders, same piercing blue eyes, but his face was etched with confusion and fear. Behind him stepped 3 men in sharp, charcoal gray suits. They wore earpieces and sunglasses despite the shade of the shop's awning. They didn't look like soldiers. They looked like the people who gave soldiers their orders. The leader of the group, a man with silver hair and a face that looked like it was made of cold plastic, stepped forward. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the trembling boys in the corner. His eyes went straight to the open, rusty box on the counter. "Mr. Thorne," the man said, his voice as dry as parchment. "My name is Director Vance. You've been a very difficult man to find. For 40 years, the United States government has listed you as missing in action, presumed deceased in the jungles of Laos. Imagine our surprise when a digital signature from a dampening field, a technology we thought was lost in '74, suddenly blinked onto our satellites right here in this little shop." Silas didn't blink. "The technology wasn't lost, Vance. It was hidden. There's a difference. It was hidden because men like you don't know how to use it without turning the world into a graveyard." Vance smiled, a cold, humorless expression. "The world is already a graveyard, Silas. We're just the groundskeepers. Now, step away from the box. That hardware, the silver colt, and especially that stone are property of the Special Projects Division. You're in possession of classified materials that could start a third world war." Leo stepped between his grandfather and the suits. "Wait a minute. You told me my grandfather was a hero. You said you were taking me here to give him an award." Silas placed a heavy hand on Leo's shoulder, pulling him back gently. "They didn't lie, Leo. They just didn't tell the whole truth. In their world, an award is often a cage." Marcus stepped forward, the shotgun still in his hands. "Vance, you're out of your jurisdiction. This is a private business in a town that doesn't take kindly to suits pushing around its elders. Silas is a veteran. He's a citizen, and unless you have a warrant signed by a judge who isn't on your payroll, you can take your sunglasses and get out of my shop." Vance didn't look intimidated. He gestured to the black SUV outside. 2 more men emerged, carrying heavy cases. "We don't need a warrant for a recovery operation of an extinction-level asset, Miller. We know who you are, too. Marcus Miller, retired Special Forces. You shouldn't be protecting him. You should be thanking us for keeping this box out of the hands of our enemies." "The enemy isn't outside," Silas said, stepping toward the counter. He reached into the box and picked up the obsidian star, the metal with the glowing red stone. As his fingers touched it, the red light pulsed, synchronized with his heartbeat. The air in the shop began to hum again, louder this time. The city boys, Tyler and Jake, finally found their legs and tried to bolt for the door, but one of the suits blocked their path. "Stay put," the agent barked. "You've seen too much already." "Let them go," Silas commanded. His voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of a farmer. It was the voice of the ghost of the Mekong, a man who had commanded legends. The sheer authority in his tone made the agent instinctively step aside. Tyler and Jake didn't wait. They ran out the door and didn't stop until they reached their car, their laughter from earlier a distant, shameful memory. Vance narrowed his eyes. "The stone is reacting to you. That's impossible. The interface was supposed to degrade after 30 years. "Honor doesn't degrade," Silas replied. He turned to Leo, holding the glowing metal out. "Leo, they want this because they think it's a weapon. They think it's a power source. But it's not. It's a record. It holds the names and the final moments of every man in the ghost unit. Men who died so people like those boys could laugh in safety. Men whose families were never told the truth." Vance reached for his jacket, likely for a weapon. "That's enough, Thorne. Secure the asset." The agents moved, but Marcus was faster. He leveled the shotgun at Vance's chest. "Next person who moves leaves this shop in a bag." The standoff was absolute. The silence returned, but it was electric. Leo looked at the metal, then at his grandfather's scarred hands. He saw the truth for the first time, not the sanitized version from his history books, but the raw, bleeding reality of sacrifice. "Grandpa," Leo whispered, "what do I do?" Silas looked at Marcus, then back at his grandson. "You do what we couldn't, Leo. You tell the world. You don't let them bury the names again. Marcus has the files. I have the hardware. And you have the future." Suddenly, the red stone in the metal flared with a blinding intensity. The electronics in the shop, the lights, the digital registers, even the agent's earpieces shrieked with static and died. In the darkness of the shop, only the box and the metal remained visible, glowing with an ancient, defiant light. "The reveal is coming, Vance," Silas said into the gloom, "and no amount of security is going to stop the truth from coming home." The darkness in the shop was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of 50 years of unspoken history. The electromagnetic pulse from the obsidian star had rendered every modern piece of technology in the room useless. The buzzing fluorescent lights were dead, the security cameras were blind, and the agent's sophisticated communication gear was now just expensive plastic and metal. In this sudden, eerie gloom, only the red pulse of the metal and the faint golden glow of the iron chest illuminated the faces of the men gathered there. Director Vance stood motionless, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floorboards. His cold, plastic face was finally showing a crack of genuine concern. He had spent his entire career managing variables, controlling narratives, and burying assets. But Silas Thorne was a variable that refused to be solved. "Thorne," Vance said, his voice echoing in the dead space. "You have no idea what you've just done. That pulse, it didn't just kill the lights, it sent a signal. Every recovery team within 500 miles is now converging on Oak Creek. You've turned this peaceful little town into a target." Silas didn't flinch. He stood with his hand resting on the silver grip of the Colt 1911, not to draw it, but to ground himself. "Oak Creek has always been a target, Vance. The world is a target as long as people like you keep the truth locked in boxes and the heroes buried in unmarked graves. You didn't come here for the safety of the town. You came because you're afraid the Ghost Unit's files contain your name." Marcus Miller moved silently through the dark, his eyes adjusted to the shadows from years of night operations. He positioned himself by the heavy gun rack, his presence a silent wall of defiance. "He's right, Vance. I've heard the rumors in the underground for years about a director who sold out a deep cover unit in Laos just to secure a promotion and a budget increase. I just never thought I'd be standing in the same room as the man who did it." Leo Thorne looked from the glowing metal to his grandfather. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Everything he had been taught at the academy, duty, honor, country, was being tested in real time. He saw the suits, the black SUVs, and the cold efficiency of the government he was preparing to serve. And then he saw Silas, the man who had raised him, whose hands were scarred not just from the plow, but from holding the line when the world had forgotten there was a line to hold. "Grandpa," Leo said, his voice steadying, "if that metal holds the names of the men, if it holds the truth, how do we get it out? How do we show everyone?" Silas turned his gaze to his grandson. A small, sad smile touched his weathered lips. "The stone isn't just a record, Leo. It's a key. It was designed by the best minds of a generation that thought they were saving the world. It's an analog transmitter. It doesn't need satellites. It doesn't need the internet. It uses the very iron in the soil to carry its message." Vance lunged forward, his patience finally snapping. "Secure the asset. Use lethal force if necessary." The agents moved with practiced precision, drawing their silenced sidearms. But Marcus was a ghost in his own shop. He fired the shotgun into the ceiling, a deafening roar that shook the building. The muzzle flash illuminated the room for a split second, showing the agents diving for cover. "The next one is at eye level," Marcus roared. In the confusion, Silas grabbed the jagged piece of dark metal from the box, the fragment that looked like it belonged to the stars. He pressed it against the red stone of the obsidian star. The reaction was instantaneous. A low-frequency hum vibrated through the floor, a sound so deep it could be felt in the marrow of their bones. A holographic projection began to shimmer in the center of the shop. It was grainy, flickering with the static of 5 decades, but it was clear enough. Faces appeared in the air, young men, laughing, sitting on the edge of a helicopter in a humid jungle clearing. One by one, their names appeared in glowing script beneath them. These were the Invisible 50, the men who had died in a war that never existed. And then a document appeared, a direct order signed by a much younger Vance, authorizing the expendability of the unit to protect a failed political operation. "You see, Leo," Silas said, his voice echoing over the hum. "They didn't just kill my brothers. They stole their dignity. They made sure no one would ever thank them. They turned their blood into a footnote in a classified folder." Vance's face was twisted in rage. "It was for the greater good. You were soldiers. You knew the risks." "We knew the risk of dying in battle," Silas countered, his eyes burning with an ancient fire. "We didn't know the risk of being betrayed by the very flag we wore on our shoulders." The projection shifted again, showing the final mission. The screen was filled with fire and the sound of a crashing rotor. Silas was there, younger, his face covered in soot, dragging a man from the wreckage. He was clutching the iron box, the very chest that sat on the counter today. "I swore to them," Silas whispered. "I swore that if I made it out, I wouldn't let them be forgotten. I spent 40 years waiting for a man like Marcus to have a shop like this, and a grandson like you to have the courage to listen." Outside, the sound of more sirens began to wail, approaching fast. The backup Vance had promised was arriving. The shop was surrounded. The black SUVs were joined by armored transport vehicles. Oak Creek was no longer a quiet farming town. It was the center of a storm. "Marcus," Silas said, closing the lid of the box with a finality that sounded like a tomb closing. "Get Leo out of here. Take the box. The metal is already broadcasting. It's too late to stop the signal. Within an hour, every news station in the country will have these files." "I'm not leaving you, Silas," Marcus said, his finger tight on the trigger. "You have to," Silas said, looking at Leo. "He's the legacy. I'm just the ghost. Go through the basement tunnel, the one we built back in '82. It leads to the old mill." Vance barked into his dead radio, then realized it was useless. He looked at his men. Take them, now. Forget the asset, just kill the signal. As the agents rushed forward, Silas picked up the silver Colt 1911. He didn't point it at them. He pointed it at the dark fragment of metal on the counter. One shot into this stone, Vance, and the resulting blast will take this entire block with it. Do you want to see if your greater good includes dying in a gun shop in Oak Creek? The agents froze. Vance hesitated. In that moment of doubt, Marcus grabbed Leo by the collar and pulled him toward the back office. "Go," Silas commanded. Leo looked back one last time. He saw his grandfather standing tall against the darkness, the red glow of the metal illuminating his face like a warrior from a myth. Silas Thorne wasn't an old farmer anymore. He was the guardian of the truth, and he was finally, after 50 years, at peace. The shadows in the basement of Miller's Tactical and Arms were long and cold, smelling of damp earth and gun oil. Marcus Miller moved with the fluid, silent grace of a man who had spent half his life operating in the dark. He kept one hand on Leo's shoulder, guiding him through the narrow, stone-walled tunnel, while the other held the heavy iron chest. Behind them, the muffled sounds of shouting and the heavy thud of boots on the floorboards above echoed through the ceiling. Silas was still up there, standing his ground against Vance and his wolves. Leo's breath was shallow and jagged. "We can't just leave him, Marcus. He's an old man. They'll kill him." Marcus stopped for a second, his eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "Your grandfather stopped being just an old man a long time ago, Leo. Right now, he's the most dangerous thing in that shop. He's a man with nothing left to lose and a truth that's finally free. Our job, the only job that matters, is to make sure this box reaches the old mill." They reached the end of the tunnel, a heavy wooden hatch reinforced with iron bars. Marcus heaved it open, and they emerged into the skeletal remains of the Oak Creek Mill. The building was a hollowed-out shell of rusted gears and rotting timber, tucked away in a ravine where the town's outskirts met the dense forest. Marcus set the box down on a workbench that had been untouched for decades. "Listen to me, Leo. Inside this chest isn't just a gun and some metals. There's a high-frequency transmitter built into the lining. Silas knew the government would track the Obsidian Star, so he turned the chest itself into a broadcast station. But we need to line the antenna with the mill's old copper water pipes to boost the signal. We need the whole world to see those files." Leo looked at the box, then back towards the town where blue and red lights were now flashing against the night sky. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough," Marcus grunted, already stripping the insulation from a heavy wire. "Vance's backup will have thermal scanners. They'll find this tunnel soon." Back at the gun shop, the atmosphere was a pressure cooker about to explode. Silas Thorne stood behind the glass counter, the silver Colt 1911 resting loosely in his hand. Director Vance stood 10 feet away, his face etched with a desperate, frantic rage. The red pulse of the Obsidian Star was getting faster, louder, a rhythmic thump-thump that felt like the heartbeat of a giant. "You're a ghost, Silas," Vance screamed over the humming. "You don't exist. I can erase this whole town and tell the world it was a gas leak. Give me the stone." Silas looked at the director, a man who had traded his soul for a seat at a mahogany table. "You still don't get it, Vance. You can erase a man. You can even erase a unit. But you can't erase the memory of the soil. The blood we spilled in that jungle, it didn't just disappear. It stayed in the air. It stayed in the water. And now it's coming home to roost." Suddenly, the front windows of the shop shattered inward. 2 tactical teams in black combat gear breached the building, flashbangs detonating in a blinding white strobe. Silas didn't flinch. He dove behind the heavy oak counter, the silver Colt barking 3 times. Each shot was precise, hitting the tactical lights on the agents' helmets, plunging the room into a chaotic dance of shadows and muzzle flashes. In the darkness, Silas was a predator. He moved between the racks of rifles, using the shop he knew by heart to flank the younger, faster men. He wasn't fighting like a soldier anymore. He was fighting like a farmer protecting his flock. At the mill, Leo worked with frantic energy. He followed Marcus's instructions, wrapping the copper wire around the rusted pipes that ran up the central spine of the building. As he connected the final lead to the iron chest, the box began to vibrate. The golden glow intensified, turning into a brilliant, shimmering pillar of light that shot upward, passing through the rotted roof and into the clouds. "It's working!" Leo shouted. Marcus checked his ruggedized tablet. The files are uploading. The Pentagon's firewalls are melting. CNN, the BBC, independent journalists, they're all getting the Ghost Unit data packet right now. The names, the orders, the betrayals, it's all out there. But their victory was interrupted by the high-pitched whine of a drone overhead. A spotlight cut through the darkness of the mill, pinning them to the floor. "They found us," Marcus hissed, drawing his sidearm. "Leo, stay behind the box. Don't let them touch the transmitter." 3 black SUVs tore into the mill's clearing, tires spraying gravel. Agents spilled out, but these weren't the suits from earlier. These were cleaners, men in gray fatigues with no patches and no mercy. They opened fire immediately, the sound of automatic weapons tearing into the old wood of the mill. Marcus returned fire, pinning a group behind their vehicle. But there were too many of them. Inside the gun shop, Silas was down to his last magazine. He was leaning against the back wall, blood seeping from a graze on his shoulder. Vance stood over him holding a suppressed pistol. "It's over, Silas," Vance said, his voice trembling with a mix of relief and hatred. "The mill is surrounded. My men are securing the box as we speak. You lost." Silas looked up, a bloody grin on his face. He checked his old watch. "Actually, Vance, look at the sky." Vance turned toward the window. The pillar of light from the mill was gone, but in its place, the clouds were glowing with a strange, pulsing red hue. Every phone in the pockets of the agents began to chime simultaneously. Every radio frequency was being overridden by a single recorded voice, the voice of Silas Thorne from 50 years ago, reporting the betrayal of his unit. "The truth doesn't need a box anymore," Silas whispered. Just as the lead cleaner reached the iron chest at the mill, the box didn't explode with fire, it exploded with information. A massive electromagnetic burst fried the electronics of the SUVs and the drone, leaving the agents in total darkness. Marcus and Leo seized the moment. They pushed a heavy gear assembly over, blocking the entrance to the mill's upper floor. "We have to go back for him," Leo pleaded. "We don't have to," Marcus said, looking toward the shop. The sound of a heavy military transport helicopter echoed over the town, but it didn't have the markings of Vance's department. It was the National Guard, led by a general who had just received the Obsidian Star's broadcast on his private terminal. The tide had turned. The hunter was now the prey. The night sky over Oak Creek was no longer dark. It was alive with the thrumming of heavy rotors and the sweeping searchlights of a military intervention that the town had never seen in its quiet history. The National Guard, alerted by the unstoppable broadcast of the Obsidian Star, had arrived in force. But inside the walls of Miller's Tactical and Arms, the air was still and heavy, smelling of ozone and spent brass. Silas Thorne sat on the floor, leaning against the sturdy oak of the gun counter. The silver Colt lay in his lap, its ivory grip glowing faintly in the dying red light of the metal. Director Vance was no longer standing over him with a weapon. He was huddled against the far wall, his hands over his ears as the sound of the broadcast, the names of the men he had betrayed, reverberated through the very foundation of the building. The front door, already battered and broken, was kicked open one final time. But this wasn't a breach, it was a rescue. Leo Thorne was the first one through, followed closely by Marcus Miller. Leo didn't look at the soldiers behind him. He didn't look at the cowering director. He ran straight to his grandfather. "Grandpa, we did it! It's everywhere! The signal hit the main servers. They can't delete it. They can't hide it anymore." Silas looked up, his eyes weary, but filled with a peace that hadn't been there for 50 years. He reached out a trembling, calloused hand and gripped Leo's shoulder. "Then the debt is paid, Leo. My brothers, they can finally come home." The National Guard commander, a stern-faced colonel, stepped into the shop. He looked at the chaos, the broken glass, and the cowering Director Vance. Then he saw Silas. He recognized the medal on the counter, the obsidian star. Without a word, the colonel snapped to attention and delivered a sharp, crisp salute. "Master Sergeant Thorne," the colonel said, his voice echoing with respect. "On behalf of a grateful nation, we are sorry it took so long." The agents of the Special Projects Division were disarmed and led away in zip ties. Vance was hauled out of the shop, his face pale and his career in ruins. As he passed Silas, the old farmer didn't even look at him. Vance was already a ghost, a relic of a secret world that had just been dragged into the light. A week later, the sun rose over Oak Creek with a different kind of warmth. The story of the ghost of the Mekong had become a global phenomenon. People realized that the quiet old man who fixed fences and tended to his corn was actually a man who had carried the weight of a nation's secrets on his back. A formal ceremony was held at the town's small cemetery. It wasn't just the locals in attendance. Hundreds of veterans from across the country had traveled to Oak Creek. There were men in suits, men in biker leather, and young soldiers in active duty uniforms. They all stood together as a small iron box was placed into a marble monument. Leo stood at the podium, wearing his cadet uniform. Beside him sat Marcus Miller, who had finally reopened his shop, though it was now more of a museum for the ghost unit than a store. "My grandfather told me that some things are too cold to burn," Leo said to the silent crowd. "He told me that honor doesn't degrade. He spent 40 years being just a farmer because he knew that the truth is a seed. If you bury it deep enough and protect it long enough, it will eventually break through the earth and reach the sun." Silas Thorne sat in the front row, his faded denim jacket replaced by a clean suit. He looked at the monument, then at the sky. For the first time since 1974, he didn't feel the need to look over his shoulder. The invisible 50 were invisible no more. Their names were carved into the stone, and their story was etched into the heart of the world. As the bugler began to play taps, the sound drifted over the fields of Oak Creek. It was a melody of sorrow, but also of victory. The old farmer had kept his promise. The rusty box was open, and the light inside would never go out. If this story reminded you that true heroes often walk among us in the simplest of clothes, please hit the like button. We often judge people by their appearance, but you never truly know what kind of fire is burning inside someone's rusty box. What would you do if you discovered your family had a secret like Silas Thorne's? Tell us your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell for more high-stakes stories of justice, honor, and the hidden truth. Thank you for watching, and remember, respect is earned, but honor is eternal.